character of the neighborhood. That's fine. That's good. But you're still creating more housing opportunity and more housing affordability. So if one is raising the question, will my housing values go down? I believe that can be answered, and that's a fair discussion and a fair debate. But when I hear some rhetoric, and I don't think it's always intended, it really isn't, because I don't think people in the city, anybody in the city, or most people in the city have hard hearts in any way. I think we all think of ourselves as fair and non-biased, but as we know in the racial equity world, implicit bias is also a reality. So when I hear somebody say, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not an exact quote, so don't criticize me for not saying it exactly. But when I hear a leader in the neighborhood movement say, you know, people may not be able to live in Land Park because of affordability, but they can sure use our park. That troubles me as a Sacramentan, because everybody should have the opportunity to not only play in Land Park, but to live in Land Park, to play in McKinley Park and to live in and around McKinley Park, to live, to play on the Greenhaven Greenbelt where I live, and to be able to live in Greenhaven, to play at the beautiful parks in North Natomas, and to be able to live in North Natomas. That's the Sacramento that we all uphold, that we love, that we value. And you better believe this drive for inclusion and equity is the driving force of our city, and it is going to continue to be well beyond my tenure here, because the city is changing, and it is changing for the better. And it's because we're all in it together. And so as we have this debate, Angelique is correct. We're not voting on the final policy. The outreach of the community is important. Public education is important. The design standards are important. All of it. But let us have the fair arguments about design, about economics, and let's not go to the other side there, even inadvertently, and suggest that some people cannot live in all of our neighborhoods because that's just the way that it is. Because that's not the way it is. Not in Sacramento. Let's call the roll.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Ashby?
Yes.
That was a yes. Councilmember Laloe?
Aye.
Councilmember Laloe?
Aye.
Thank you. Councilmember Harris?
Enthusiastically, yes.
Councilmember Valenzuela?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Chenier?
Aye.
Councilmember Guerra?
Aye.
Councilmember Jennings?
Yes, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Vang?
Yes, from the best district.
And Mayor Steinberg?
Yes. All right. Thank you. We move forward. And great job, staff. Appreciate it. That was excellent.
Oh, it's on now.
Okay, we have one more item tonight, and that is item, is it 15, Madam Clerk?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, you're on item 16 now, the police department
Item
presentation
16.
on protest
Let's go to item
activity.
16. I turn it over to the city manager and our police chief.
Thank you. Mayor and Council, I get to bring it home, or we get to bring it home, as this is the last item for tonight. I have agendized this item in response to some questions that were raised in previous council meetings, and we've been getting some email traffic and phone calls about how we've been handling the protests over the last couple of months. So I thought it'd be a good idea if Chief Hahn kind of gives us an overview of what's been going on over the last couple of months, and then talk about a few specific issues that came up during the, like I said, the last couple of council meetings. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Daniel Hahn, your police chief. Tonight, we are here to present information regarding protest-related activities in our downtown core over the last couple of months. But before I turn it over to Deputy Chief Kathy Lester, I'd like to begin by talking about the differences between root or cause and the condition of what we've been experiencing in our city. We're the 6th largest city in the most populous state of our union, the 9th largest capital city in the United States of America. We are no stranger to protests. We have daily protests in our city and have for many years. These protests range from just a few people to thousands of people. They range from speeches at the state capitol or Chavez Park to marching in our streets. We have experienced countless protests for many causes over the last couple of years, including protests regarding Stephon Clark and George Floyd. Over the last couple of months, we have had protests occurring on a weekly basis, mainly on Saturdays, that include people protesting the recent national election and the health order restrictions. In general, with a couple of exceptions, the Sacramento Police Department has been consistent in our response to protests in our streets, regardless of the protesters' beliefs. We have tried to keep our community safe, prevent violence, minimize property damage, and ensure everyone's constitutional rights were protected. One of those exceptions was during the initial George Floyd protests at the end of May and the beginning of June, when the protests turned violent and destructive, when there was mass looting, attempts to burn down buildings, and violent acts towards officers. This is why many businesses downtown are boarded up to this day. During most protests, including those regarding Stephon Clark and George Floyd, the people who took to our streets were often very diverse and were demanding changes in law enforcement and demanding equity in general. These protests often blocked streets and caused disruption to our normal business in the downtown area and elsewhere. They involved individuals who were often emotional, angry, and extremely vocal about their demands for change. Although there were notable exceptions, these protests typically weren't extremely violent, nor did they typically result in mass destruction in our city. At times, other groups came downtown, such as Antifa. They dressed in armor, wore helmets, vests, carried backpacks full of projectiles, carried unknown liquids, possessed shields and other weapons, and were very different from most of the ongoing protests. They were violent and left a wake of property damage in their path. During the early protests that were often diverse, some of our local community publicly stated, posted on social media, or sent other forms of communication calling for me and the Sacramento Police Department to take a more aggressive stance, make more arrests, and basically be more forceful with the individuals in our streets. There were calls for consequences and overwhelming force. I haven't seen these same people come with that same energy and those same demands during the latest protests that involved groups such as Proud Boys. At all times, the Sacramento Police Department made decisions we thought best protected life, both our officers' lives and the lives of the members of our community, and property. Now we come to the last couple months. Regular protests continue to take place in the downtown core, often at the Capitol, to protest things such as the health order and the recent election. In addition to these protests, other radical groups joined in the activities downtown. Groups such as Proud Boys, which the Southern Poverty Law Center lists as a hate group, and Antifa. These groups brag on social media about committing violence on the opposing group. They spend their time not protesting and exercising their constitutionally protected rights, but by searching each other out to commit violence. They often dress like our military personnel or SWAT officers. They are not protesting. As they chase each other around downtown, they catch our officers and our community in the crossfire. They have assaulted and robbed residents, as well as threatened the limited media representatives in our downtown core. They have pulled valuable resources, our officers and our professional staff, from our neighborhoods that so desperately need them during a time of significant increases in violent crime. We have routinely assigned almost a third of our entire department on those weekly Saturday occurrences over the last 2 months. One group, based on what some experts say, is a white extremist group that seems to desire to return to our past while the other groups seem to want to destroy our form of government altogether. Regardless of their ideologies, they are both violent and put our community in danger. I've often heard complete surprise in the reaction of reporters, politicians, and the public in regard to what happened in our nation's capital 2 weeks ago. Radicalized individuals broke into our United States Capitol and stated that they wanted to do harm not only to our elected officials, but our way of governance. I wasn't surprised at all. Well, I was surprised that they were able to force their way into the Capitol, but I was not surprised they were there in those numbers. I wasn't surprised about their ideology, and I wasn't surprised about their intent. I wasn't surprised because I know our country's history, and the exact same thing has been occurring in our streets every Saturday for the last 2 months. One possible reason so many people might be surprised about what occurred in Washington, D.C. is that our primary media sources haven't covered what has been occurring in Sacramento over the last 2 months, which is the same as what occurred in Washington, D.C., but on a much smaller scale. Our primary media sources, both national and local, extensively covered the previous protests regarding Stephon Clark and George Floyd. If you were not downtown or following our department's social media over the last 2 months, you would not know about the violence that occurred because it wasn't widely covered by the media. One of the only primary sources that covered most, if not all, of the Saturday unrest was Capitol Public Radio, who often put out updates to our community on social media. This lack of coverage left room for other groups and individuals to post things that were misleading or not true on social media. One example of information that was not true and widely spread on social media was when a video was posted that a Sacramento police officer told a Proud Boy member that Sac PD had their six, or in other words, Sac PD had their back, and stated that this was proof that the Sacramento Police Department supports a radical group such as the Proud Boys. We researched this incident on our body-worn camera system and were able to clearly see that, in fact, it was the member of the Proud Boys saying that to the officers that were trying to keep the two groups apart, not the other way around. Last Friday, I had the privilege to virtually spend a couple hours with teens from Impact SAC. This is an amazing group of teens that recently, during the health pandemic, developed a mental health resource for teens called Check Your Vibe. We spent a couple hours discussing recent protests in our city and across the country, including Washington, D.C. They said things such as that they were scared. They were angry. They said, let it have been us, and it would have been different. One teen said that they had a friend who condoned the violence in Washington, D.C., but had previously condemned the Black Lives Matter protests. Some said that they were scared to go outside. Many questioned why they never saw what was occurring in Sacramento on the news. One teen said the news shows white people in a good light and black people in a bad light. These young people are paying attention. They are observant and are more than willing than ever to get involved in what I would call the root or the cause of what is at the heart of this unrest. I'm going to give a disclaimer before I move on. I shouldn't have to give this disclaimer, but I will because I know the response I will get from many. I love the United States of America. This is my country. I love Sacramento community, the community I was born in, and I've lived my entire life, and I wouldn't choose to live anywhere else. See, I have to explain this because certain groups in our country have always been challenged about their patriotism whenever they want our country to improve and live up to the ideals written in our Constitution. During World War II, when the Black community developed the Double V campaign, they were condemned for not being patriotic, simply because they wanted one V for victory abroad and one V for victory at home, to end Jim Crow and have equal rights in our country, and in a country that they were willing to give their lives for. I know I will hear about what I'm saying today. Yet the people who break into the United States Capitol, threaten to hang and kill our elected representatives, and actually kill a police officer, those people are often called patriots. Lost cause type of ideology in our country is alive and well, and it has been on display for several months, not only in Sacramento, but across the country, culminating in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago. Groups who desire to go back to our past, the good old days that weren't so good for everyone. The problem with the lost cause ideology now is the same as it was in our past. What people hear about our country and the ideals we hold dear, some in our country don't always see or experience in reality. It's why when I talk root and cause, I receive letters, emails, social media posts that California and the West Coast don't have to deal with such issues because we entered the Union as a free state. We never had slaves. Slavery was a long time ago. Jim Crow is a relic of our past and only in the South. Redlining, blockbusting, sundown towns, racial housing covenants, discriminatory loan practices, and disparate educational opportunities were all either a thing of the past, only in our southern states, or never existed at all in our beloved country. It is why I regularly hear that the only reason I'm police chief in my hometown after 33 years of policing is because I am Black. Unfortunately, all this is untrue. These beliefs are born out of ignorance and a lack of knowledge about how we got here. It is why when diverse groups protest in our streets regarding Stephon Clark and George Floyd, among others, demanding changes to law enforcement and changes to systems that they believe are embedded with systemic racism, and simply demanding equity in our country, they are often called savages. Many in our community call for violent or harsh response from law enforcement. We call them unpatriotic. And often protesters are told, if you don't like it, get out of our country. Yet, when a mostly white group, some carrying the battle flag of the Confederacy, wearing t-shirts glamorizing some of the worst atrocities in world history, construct a noose hanging from gallows, yelling racial slurs at Capitol police officers, defecating and urinating in the halls of our United States Capitol, breaking into the offices of our elected officials, stealing property, damaging property, and threatening to hang and kill our elected representatives, and actually assaulting and killing police officers. Many of us call this group patriots. We, as a country, need to address the root and the cause of our challenges. We need to deal with our history and the issue of race and difference, or we will continue to see radicalized groups take to our streets and commit violence. We will continue to see angry, upset, emotional people protesting our streets, demanding equity, fairness, and our country to live up to the ideals enshrined in our Constitution. It is the cause and the root that reveals itself when two young Black kids are gunned down in the local mall by another Black kid. We respond by calling them savages, that it's just the Black culture, and that it is what happens when you don't have parents. Yet, when Kyle Rittenhouse drives to Kenosha, Wisconsin and guns down two people at a protest, we say he's misunderstood, had a troubled childhood, and was bullied in school. We start a GoFundMe and raise $2 million and bail him out of jail. And recently, he was reported to be in a bar drinking at 18 years old with members of the group Proud Boys, a group that has regularly participated in the unrest in our city. They were taking pictures and flashing white power hand signs. What's the difference between the two, between the shooting in our mall and in the shooting in Kenosha? What do you do with groups that we consider savages? What do you do and how do you deal with savages? If we knew our history, we would know how we got here. We would know the root and the cause. The Sacramento Police Department is not perfect. I make mistakes. Our department makes mistakes. We need to continue to get better as a department at safely dealing with protests and our day-to-day mission. We need to continue to build more trust in our community, especially in our communities that need us the most. With that being said, we, as a department, try to address the condition as well as the root cause. We train our officers in crowd control and provide them with protective equipment along with less lethal equipment, and we provide our leaders with incident command training and experiences. This is all to deal with the condition or the actual protest. But we also provide our officers with training and experiences that address the root cause and the unrest across our country. Things such as bias training, the history of how we got here, and history's influence on today. We have invited Stanford University, Washington State, Center for Policing Equity, American Leadership Forum, and the Department of Justice all to examine our department. research issues such as bias and relationships with our community, and to provide training on bias and history. But if we don't address this as a country, our condition will continue to challenge us, and we will continue to have unrest in our city, often in the form of violence. We are fortunate in Sacramento to have a city manager in Howard Chan that is not only concerned about our condition, but also the root cause of our condition. He has implemented processes to learn our history, address bias and equity. This council has also implemented positions that focus on equity within the city. Through the unrest and violence in our city over the last couple months, I could not be more proud of the officers and the professional staff of the Sacramento Police Department. The people have been working the ongoing protests and the violent acts that some groups come to our city to inflict on each other, our officers and our neighbors. Our officers and professional staff, they continue to show up. They continue to perform admirably in the most trying of circumstances, all while putting themselves in harm's way, in addition to their families, in harm's way due to the current pandemic ravaging our country as they work these protests, that many people don't wear masks. As you look at cities across our country and the level of violence and destruction occurring, there have been people killed, both protesters and police officers, and cities have burned. Sacramento has not experienced this level of violence and destruction, and a large part of that is due to the officers that wear the Sacramento Police Department uniform and our allied agency partners that have come to our city to assist. In 1962, Malcolm X, who some would consider a controversial figure, gave a speech in Los Angeles where he stated that we must go to the cause or the root, that dealing with the condition is not enough. What we are talking about tonight in the upcoming presentation from Deputy Chief Kathy Lester, and for good reason due to the threat to the safety of our community, make no mistake, this presentation is about our condition. Until we as a country, state, and city deal with the cause and the root of our condition, we will continue to put our community and our officers in the middle of warring factions that don't want our country to live up to the ideals written in our Constitution. And instead, people will continue to be injured and killed in these so-called protests, and our collective potential will be stifled. One day after many of us quoted and celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we need to live up to what he preached and not just repeat his quotes. I will now turn it over to Deputy Chief Kathy Lester to discuss the facts on what has occurred in our city over the last 2 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Let me go ahead and get the presentation up. All right. Can everyone see that? All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kathy Lester. I'm your Deputy Chief who oversees the Patrol Division and also our 911 call center. Tonight, I'd like to provide an overview of how we, your department, respond to protests within our city, an overview of certain events that have taken place within the city, specifically those that have occurred since the November elections, and discuss the impact that these events have had on our community. So like the chief said, we are really pretty well versed on protests, being the capital city of California. We have been the location of a number of high-profile protests, all the way back to USDA, the education protests from a decade ago, post-Ferguson protests, Stephon Clark, most recently a lot of social justice issues, and then even more recently, the 2020 election. We do have small protests almost daily in Sacramento, and they can range from just a few people, like the chief said, up to large groups, but they're generally handled by our officers as part of their regular duties and are generally uneventful. However, this year has been really unique. Since May of 2020, we have had to develop formal plans and formally staff or prepare for over 200 events. The events that I'm going to talk about tonight are really going to focus on everything that's happened since the week of the election. We have typically had these weekly events and protests that have occurred on Saturdays. And the problem has arisen because we're seeing clashes between Proud Boys and their affiliates and Antifa. Proud Boys are a far-right, neo-fascist, and male-only political organization that promotes and engages in political violence in both the U.S. and Canada. And like the chief mentioned, they have been designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The other side of this is Antifa. Antifa is a political protest movement comprising of autonomous groups affiliated by their militant opposition to fascism and other forms of extreme right-wing ideology. Despite their tendency towards violence, neither group is defined as a criminal gang in California. So what we've seen are typically pro-Trump rallies on the west side of the Capitol, and these rallies have included members of Proud Boys and their associates. On the Antifa side, we have seen a gathering of various local social groups that support the Antifa ideology and utilize black bloc tactics as well as their affiliates who are with them, which I'll refer to as affiliates and counter-protesters throughout the presentation. Just to define what a black bloc tactic is, that's a tactic that is used by protesters who wear black clothing, ski masks, scarves, helmets with padding, other face concealing and face protecting items to conceal their identity and hinder criminal prosecution. And I'll point a lot of this out as we go through the presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is just really what the mission is of the Sacramento Police Department. So when we are talking about how we handle protests and how we respond, we want to prevent acts of violence and property damage, but still allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights in a peaceful manner. And the First Amendment, I won't get into a lot of legal stuff here, it protects free speech to a great extent. However, under certain circumstances, demonstrations and conduct can be regulated. And so when you have groups that have a tendency towards violence, like we've seen between the Proud Boy group and the Antifa group, we are allowed to institute certain restrictions. But in order to do that, we have to follow a number of guidelines that are set forth by the Supreme Court. The first one is that the regulation has to be content neutral and that we cannot choose sides or favor one group over the other. They also must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest. So in this case, we can apply restrictions if they support public safety. And we have to leave open ample alternative channels for communicating the speaker's message. And so what that means in like regular terms is that people have to be able to see and hear each other. But what this does allow us to do is it allows us to separate the groups in an attempt to preserve the peace. And so throughout this presentation, you're going to see what we've been doing to manage these events. And you're going to see us do a lot of division and a lot of separation of these groups. And like the chief said, I want to make sure that we differentiate between legitimate First Amendment activity and criminal behavior. As you will see in the events I'm going to talk about, there are protesters involved in these that are lawfully exercising their rights. However, there is also criminal behavior and violence that has been exhibited by both groups as well. So I would like to just thank the mayor and council, our great city manager, for giving the department the opportunity to present more information to the public on these events. We are really committed to providing timely and accurate information to our community, and much of what we are going to show you here has had very limited coverage in the mainstream media. Having said that, during the presentation, I'm going to use a variety of open source public material from social media and television, as well as a number of videos from our body-worn cameras. So our intent here is to create a picture for the public of these protests, which at times have turned violent. But I do need to warn viewers that some of this material is graphic in nature. So I'm going to go through the events starting the week of the election. The week of the election was actually very uneventful. We had little protest activity during the week. But if you remember the evening of that Friday, it looked like President Biden was going to win the election, and it was announced Saturday morning on the 7th. And that's the first event I'm going to talk about here. We had assigned 35 officers to manage this event. And once that announcement came out, several hundred pro-Trump protesters came to the west side of the Capitol in a show of support for President Trump. At its height, about 500 pro-Trump supporters were present. However, also present at this event were a group of Proud Boys. And if you look at the upper left-hand picture on your screen, you'll see that they wear very distinctive clothing and they're easy to pick out of a group. During the event, we had a couple of fights break out between Biden supporters and Trump supporters. And on this very first day, before the event had really even started, we had an assault that occurred between demonstrators on Capitol grounds. Some pepper spray was sprayed between them, and one female was hit in the face. Both CHP and SACPD provided aid to the parties, but neither side wanted to prosecute. And we see that, and we will see that a number of times as it relates to assaults that have taken place during these events. So in cases such as these, if prosecution is not desired, law enforcement does not make an arrest. And just a quick note here, because it can be kind of confusing. I want to make sure that people understand that the state capitol and the grounds surrounding the capitol are CHP's jurisdiction, and the city streets and sidewalks are the jurisdiction of the police department. We've worked very closely with the CHP throughout these events, and at times have also called in the Sacramento Sheriff's Office for some additional support. So as the day went on, and this is the first Saturday after the election again, we saw some additional fights and skirmishes. We saw demonstrators pepper spray each other, and we could see and really feel the animosity increasing between the groups. So this is the intersection of 10th and L towards later on in the event, where we used officers to form lines to try and prevent mixing of the groups, again, to allow them to see and hear each other, but to try and prevent violence. So this is one of the first clips I'm going to show here, and it is our officers, our bike officers, working to divide the crowd to prevent an escalation of events. As you can see, there are some very heated emotions involved here, and the officers become the target, which is a theme we're going to see throughout these events. By about 5 p.m., we were able to keep the group separated long enough, and the groups dwindled, and eventually all protesters left without further incident. However, throughout the week, we saw more information coming out that this type of event was going to be held again at the state capitol. So we staffed the Saturday, November 14th event with 92 of our officers. Right before the event started, officers made a stop and an arrest of a pro-Trump supporter for the possession of a handgun. And for this event, we had also placed barricades out in the area to assist the officers in keeping the group separate. We made no arrests, and other than the handgun, and no officers were injured or use of force was used during the event. So essentially, this was a static protest at the Capitol. This was also the day, if you remember, of the Million MAGA March at the U.S. Capitol. The pro-Trump group, which included Proud Boys again, gathered on 10th Street in front of the Capitol. The Antifa group and their associates gathered in Roosevelt Park and then marched to the Capitol, where confrontations took place between both groups. In addition, there was a pro-Trump car caravan, and this is something we saw at numerous events, which were car rallies that generally started or originated outside of the city. They'd be long lines of cars that would caravan to the Capitol, and then they would drive around the Capitol. And this required our officers to manage some significant traffic issues while also maintaining peace at the Capitol. The event ended about 4 o'clock, and I am going to show you a clip that does come from a news station in the Bay Area. This is media coverage we had of the event. We had one fairly significant fight that occurred on Capitol grounds, where a group of Proud Boys confronted and fought with Antifa. You will see that fight documented in this media clip. One correction I would like to make is at the end, they note that there were several arrests. However, the arrests were not entirely accurate. We did detain people. However, again, prosecution was not desired, and therefore the subjects were released and not arrested.
So-called Million MAGA March took over the nation's capital today. A group of California Trump supporters rallied in Sacramento to stop the steal, in their words, echoing the president's claims of voter fraud. I-Team reporter Dan Noyes was there to see the rally break out in violence.
This is what happened when the talking stopped, when the far-right Proud Boys squared off against Antifa and other counter-protesters. This is how the day started. Just over 30% of Californians voted for President Trump in this election, and hundreds of them rallied at the state capitol. They believe Trump's still unproven claims that the election was marred by widespread voter fraud, and they're calling for a national recount.
The reality is we have had people trying to steal our nation out from under us for decades. California used to be a nice place.
The rally drew a large Asian American contingent and people from across the state. This Trump supporter was very critical of the media and declined to give his name.
I'm here to support my president. I'm here to support the Constitution. I'm here to support every American's right to vote.
On stage and scattered in the crowd, I found members of the Proud Boys, a far-right hate group according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. After the rally began, people with faces covered and wearing all black arrived. Antifa Twitter accounts had called for a response to the rally. Sacramento police and CHP on horses and in riot gear kept the opposite sides apart for most of the day.
This is really a strange setup right now. You have the rally over there that's still going on, but then back this way, you've got Antifa and other counter-protesters in a standoff with some of the Trump supporters.
You're the one that has no pride in what you're standing for. You are not taking off your helmet, your glasses, and your mask. You're scared.
Has a recount changed anything? Well, this time. Why this time? Because Trump? It's what I feel in my heart. It will happen.
Then the Proud Boys came around the block to confront the counter-protesters, unleashing a cloud of bear spray. Despite this scuffle, no serious injuries were reported. Several suffered the effects of the bear spray. Police made at least 2 arrests. For the I-Team in Sacramento, Dan Noyes, ABC 7 News.
That takes us to the following weekend, November 21st, again, a Saturday. And a lot of things were beginning to show up on social media about this event. We assigned 145 officers to this. We did make an arrest, not at Capitol Park, but later at Chavez Park for a subject using a stun gun. However, there was no use of force or officer injuries. So the pro-Trump group, which included Proud Boys, met again on the west side of the Capitol. Antifa this time gathered in Chavez Park. However, the pro-Trump group marched to the park. Officers attempted to contain the pro-Trump group on 10th Street, both at the Capitol, and if you see, here's an example of the barricades being breached in the lower left-hand corner. However, we were unsuccessful. Both groups managed to enter the park where they began to argue and fight, and we worked to separate them. And again, this was another day of a pro-Trump car caravan that was also driving through and around the Capitol. And in that rally, Proud Boys were also seen. So I'm going to show a video here. This is an example of our officers attempting to separate the groups as tensions between Proud Boys and Antifa escalated, and then officers faced off with both groups.
Move your bike out that way. There's about to be a fight behind you. We're going to need to move your bike. Move your bike. Back up. Yeah, now you're fucking scared. Swing it. Now you're fucking scared. Just bring it. Don't get into it. Come on, motherfucker. That fucker right there had a weapon. Where'd he go? That fucker right there had a lock. That guy had a weapon. He was going to hit us. You motherfucker. Yeah, come on. He's too fucking He's a chick. Yeah, people been fucking hitting their head with bike locks, you dumb cunt. Evidently the police don't care about weapons. Come get some, motherfucker. Yeah, now that the cops are here, come get some.
So again, this next clip is in Chavez Park. You know, despite our officers' efforts to keep the groups apart, they were intent on inflicting violence on each other. And so this video depicts one of those incidents. I'll kind of narrate it before it starts so you can see what happens, because it happens pretty quickly. You're going to see bike officers really quickly pulling a member of the Antifa group away from the Proud Boy group, and then pushing the Proud Boys away, and then finally pulling the Antifa demonstrator over their bikes to protect their safety. After this, we had additional fights break out in the park, and we declared what's known as an unlawful assembly, ending the event and dispersing the crowd. So the pro-Trump group and with the Proud Boys marched back to the Capitol and later dispersed without further incident. That takes us now to the following Saturday, November 28th. This was advertised a little bit differently. We did sign 128 officers to it, although the Antifa group advertised on social media that they would be conducting a shield build event at a location downtown. Although the location was not disclosed, we later saw a group of members of Antifa and counter-protesters in Chavez Park. On this day, the pro-Trump supporters and Proud Boys marched to the park to confront the Antifa group. We used a multitude of resources to try and hold the mix of pro-Trump and Proud Boy members south of J Street. Ultimately, what happened was we closed traffic on J Street, 10th Street, I Street, and 9th Street, and lined our officers up across those intersections to prevent the groups from mixing. However, despite those efforts, members of the pro-Trump and the Proud Boys group were able to enter the park by using side streets and alleys and going around officers. We did have one arrest. It wasn't related to the protest. It was a traffic stop in the area. So the video clip I'm going to show you here is from our body-worn cameras at 9th and J Street. You're going to see how the officers form lines across the intersection to keep the group separate. And this is also another good example of how we try and provide some space for both sides to demonstrate. Although the pro-Trump group eventually reached the park, officers were able to keep the groups separate in the park. And eventually there was just a small group of Antifa and counter-protesters left in the park, about 15 of them. Our officers escorted them back to their cars for their safety, and once the Antifa group had left the park, the pro-Trump group went back to the Capitol and the streets were reopened.
You guys keep sliding down, tighten it up. Good. That's good, that's good. Stop moving. Yeah, back up, back up, back up, back up. Cops don't like people behind them, okay? You're welcome to be here and filming and everything, but we don't want you 10 feet away.
I'm go over where
no, that's going to stir up trouble. We need to be over here, okay? Let's just go on the sidewalk, please. It's much easier this way.
On December 5th, we assigned 170 officers based on what we were seeing about the event. We didn't have any arrests that day, but we had 2 officers that got injured and we had 3 uses of force. We also had some really significant vandalism to cars in the area, and I'll show some pictures of that in just a few minutes. One of the officers that received an injury, received his injury by a green laser that was pointed in his eye by a member of Antifa. And this is a tactic that officers have been subjected to throughout the past year. And they're really dangerous. Lasers can be cause a lot of harm when shined directly into the eyes. And you'll see it in a later clip that I'll show. This is becoming a more commonly used tactic. At the start of the event, Antifa gathered and marched from Fremont Park to the Capitol. Once at the Capitol, they tried to move around the barricades that we had again placed in the area to keep the group separate to attack the pro-Trump group that had gathered again on the west side of the Capitol. This video depicts the hostility of the groups towards each other. In that clip, you're going to see a subject fleeing over the barricade in an attempt to get away from Antifa. And I also want you to note the gear, including gas masks and helmets on the Antifa side.
Back up.
So this shows the space that we provided to try and keep the groups apart. We have a double set of barricades. This is about a half block wide on 10th Street, just there at L. During the incident, there were items that were thrown by the protesters at each other over this area. Our officers were in the middle of these groups, and they were also directly targeted. Items included glass bottles, bottles with liquids, eggs, paint, and fireworks. So I'm going to show you this clip. It's hard to actually see the balls, but you can hear the glass breaking around the officers as the bottles hit the ground. In this next video, the Antifa group tries to push through the line of barricades that we have set out in an attempt to reach the pro-Trump group, and several of our officers were hurt trying to hold back this crowd.